the authors of a recently released book are warning about a new nuclear arms race that they say is currently underway. They're joining us for an urgent, in-depth discussion about that book. I'll show it to you right here, which is called The Button. They are William Perry, the former Secretary of Defense during the Clinton administration. He's in California. And Tom Collina, Director of the Policy Plowshares Fund, and he is in New Hampshire. Secretary Perry, you don't hear talk about a nuclear arms race. It's not discussed in the presidential race. Why not? We're assuming it's over.
Everybody believes that the dangers of nuclear weapon ended when the Cold War ended, which is not true today. In fact, the probability of a nuclear catastrophe is actually greater than it was during the Cold War, and we're entered into a new arms race as dangerous and as costly as the one in the Cold War.
Tom, if that's true, why?
Well, I think what happened is that a lot of policies that we had for the Cold War, for the arms race we had with the Soviet Union, those policies never changed even when the Cold War ended. And so, as Bill said, people have moved on. Their concerns have moved on to other issues, but the old policies are still there. And we never changed them. They're still dangerous. And in some ways, they're more dangerous than ever because people are focused on other issues and they simply don't see the dangers that we face.
Secretary Perry, why isn't it discussed?
That question is too deep for me to answer. It's a psychological question, but fundamentally, when the Cold War ended, the danger, the worry that people had, the fear that people had about a nuclear catastrophe just ended with it. And they just don't want to pick it up again. They don't want to assume it again. But unfortunately, the reality is that the danger is still very much there.
You assert, Tom, that the defining era of United States nuclear policy is that it's focused on the wrong threat. What are you talking? What's the wrong threat?
So the threat that we're focused on, a leftover threat from the Cold War, is the threat of an intentional attack from Russia. That is simply not a likely threat because it would be suicidal for Russia to launch that attack. Any attack, a nuclear attack that Russia would launch at the United States would respond with a nuclear response. And so it would be suicide for both sides. The most likely threat we face today is blundering into nuclear war by mistake. That's the threat we should focus on. That's the right threat. And by focusing on the wrong threat, yesterday's threat of a Russian intentional attack, we're actually making the threat of a blunder even worse.
Hypothetically, Mr. Secretary, give me an example of what would be a blundering threat.
I think the most obvious example is a false alarm. We have had, during the Cold War, 3 different false alarms. One of them I personally experienced by getting a phone call in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock in the morning when I got a call from the watch officer in North American Air Defense Command telling me his computer was showing 200 ICBMs on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. He quickly added that he concluded his false alarm. He was calling me to see if I could help him figure out what had gone wrong with his computers. I tell you, I will never forget that moment, and no one can ever tell me that the probability of a false alarm is theoretical. And the factors that led to the false alarms during the Cold War are still in place today. They're still in place. We still are on a quick launch policy.
Is there a way to end the president's sole nuclear authority to retire the so-called football? Tom?
Sure. I guess there's 2 ways to do that. One is the president himself could share that authority with Congress by saying only the civilian leadership can launch nuclear weapons first, but that authority would be the president's shared with Congress. We think that will be a very viable strategy. Another way to do it is for the president to simply say the United States will never use nuclear weapons first. The United States will never start nuclear war. Both of those approaches, we think, would make the United States and the world much safer because they would reduce the chance of blundering into nuclear war by mistake.
Secretary Perry, you described that phone call late at night. Did that change your perspective?
Yes, it did. It made me much more conscious that the real danger we're facing is not a surprise attack from the Soviet Union or today Russia, but as Tom has said, that we will blunder into a nuclear war. We can blunder either through an accident, like a false alarm, or through a political calculation. The poster child for political calculation of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But again, the conditions are still in place for another crisis like that today. The hostility between U.S. and Russia today is about as great as between the U.S. and Soviet Union during the Cold War. And we still have nuclear weapons faced at each other and on quick launch policies.
What's the risk of false alarms, Tom?
So the scenario that worries us the most is, imagine that there's a cyber attack. And most Americans don't realize that our command and control, our nuclear warning systems, are vulnerable to cyber attacks. So imagine there's a cyber attack that shows that there's a nuclear attack coming from Russia, let's say. That would be a false alarm, but the president wouldn't know that for some period of time and might feel the need to launch nuclear weapons within minutes before he knows whether the attack is real or false. That's the false alarm danger that we really worry about, and it's made worse by the fact that the president has sole authority to launch without consulting anyone, can launch within minutes of an alarm, and has nuclear weapons, land-based ballistic missiles, that are vulnerable to being destroyed in the ground unless the president launches quickly. So all of these things push the president towards a quick launch, which could be starting nuclear war in response to a false alarm, which to us is the worst catastrophe we can imagine.
Mr. Secretary, memory fades me, but didn't Reagan and Gorbachev sign a treaty to end it?
Well, Reagan and Gorbachev actually discussed at Reykjavik giving up all nuclear weapons, but they were not able to reach an agreement on that. They did finally have a treaty called the INF Treaty, where they got rid of where they eliminated all of the medium-range missiles. Sadly, that treaty has now been, we've now withdrawn from that treaty. In fact, we no longer have any significant treaties controlling arms, except the New START Treaty, which is about to expire.
Tom, there are other people now involved beyond Russia and the United States. How many countries have nuclear weapons?
9 countries have nuclear weapons, but Russia and the United States maintain 90% of those weapons. So when you talk about the nuclear dangers in the world, it's really primarily the United States and Russia. And when you talk about the potential to end civilization as we know it, again, it's the United States and Russia. So that's why we focus on the false alarm danger, the risk of the United States or Russia blundering into nuclear war, which literally could end civilization as we know it.
All right, Secretary of Defense, supposing a general at NORAD gets information that is wrong, could he start a nuclear attack? Could someone other than a president provoke a nuclear attack?
And the only way a nuclear attack is made possible today is through a command being sent by the president. And only the president has the communication system and the codes for doing that. So theoretically, he's the only one who can launch it. But in fact, you can imagine something inside the system going wrong. Less likely a general than to be actually the officers at the launch center. The 2 officers at the launch center, you require 2 keys to be pressed. But if those 2 officers would collude and decide to start a nuclear war, they could do it as well.
Why didn't we just disband the bomb? Tom, why wouldn't we have shown the world that we can do it and ask the rest of the world to do it and just do away with it?
Well, many people, including us, have been trying to eliminate nuclear weapons for quite some time. There are very strong forces in support of nuclear weapons. People don't tend to see it this way, but a lot of money is in the nuclear weapons industry, about $50 billion a year. So that's a lot of jobs, that's a lot of careers, that's a lot of military bases with jobs. And so unless people are demanding from their leaders to reduce nuclear weapons, the bureaucracy, the vested interests are going to make sure that it doesn't happen. And that's really the difference between now and the 1980s, when there was a public movement calling for nuclear reductions. There is no public movement anymore. And so the nuclear bureaucracy, those forces that are benefiting from the maintenance of nuclear weapons, they tend to hold sway. And so part of what we're trying to do is educate the public to say, look, unless the public gets involved, we really can't fix this situation.
Larry, I would add that when I was the Secretary of Defense, it was right at the end of the Cold War, and I thought we were on the process of eliminating nuclear weapons. In fact, between myself and the Minister of Defense of Russia, we succeeded in dismantling 8,000 nuclear weapons during the 3 years that I was Secretary of Defense. And when I left the office, I presumed that was going to continue, and we really were getting rid of them. But then that slowed down and then stopped, and we're now in the process of really restarting the nuclear arms race.
Tom, has President Trump spoken about this at all?
President Trump has spoken quite a bit about nuclear weapons, often in contradictory ways. And I think you could see him as the reason why there is concern about presidential sole authority. It's hard to imagine a president more impulsive and probably less prepared to handle the decision of launching nuclear weapons than President Trump. But today, he is the only one that can order the launch of U.S. nuclear weapons. Now, I don't mean to pick on President Trump. I would say that no president is prepared for that awesome responsibility, and no president should have it. It should be shared with Congress, or there should be a policy the United States should simply never start nuclear war.
Secretary Perry, do you fear President Trump having that sole authority?
I do fear it, but I would agree with Tom that our concern is not just with President Trump. Other presidents have proposed similar concerns in the past. When President Nixon was in the last few months of his office, he was a very heavy drinker. And so he might have made an irrational decision based on that heavy drinking. President Kennedy was under very heavy medication for the pain that he was suffering. And it's conceivable that that could have led him to problems. President Reagan, in the last few months in office, appeared to be in the first few months for early stages of Alzheimer's. So all of these problems suggest no president should be given that authority.
What, Secretary Perry, what is the football and how does that work?
The football is a nickname we give to the communication system, which the president would use if he would order a launch command. That is in a briefcase. It's carried by his attaché. The attaché is always with the president. Every time you see the president on a trip, you'll see an military officer walking discreetly behind him carrying a briefcase. That's the football. The football is the communication system by which he carries the command. There's also something, he also has to have the code to use at that particular day, and he carries that in his own pocket. So between the football and the codes, he has everything he needs to start a nuclear war at his hand every day, 24 hours a day.
Okay, we remember the films Fail Safe and Dr. Strangelove. Supposing we get a false alarm, but supposing the Russians, we get a report that they have they're preparing a nuclear attack on the United States. What do? We go to Congress to vote on this? What do we do?
Well, I think the first thing we'd say is there's no reason to have a quick launch. And that's the most dangerous thing you could do is a quick launch. If we get some notification that the Russians are about to launch, we should talk to the Russians and try to figure out what's going on. But understand that if the Russians do launch and then we launch quickly, our launch does not stop the Russians' launch. So once one side has launched, the game is over. So the highest priority is to stop any launch of any kind. So if you hear a country is considering a launch, get on the phone, talk them out of it. But us doing a quick launch isn't going to save the country.
Mr. Secretary, this may seem weird, but why not ban them all?
Well, that's a good idea, and that's an idea that President Reagan and President Gorbachev had, which they discussed seriously at Reykjavik in 1986. They were not able finally to reach that agreement, but they did follow up with the arms treaties which reduced nuclear weapons. President Reagan believed that nuclear weapons are a great danger, and he was working to try to get rid of them, but he did not ultimately succeed. President Obama believed that they were a great danger, and he worked to try to get rid of them, but he did not succeed either. The forces resisting reducing the nuclear weapons are really very formidable.
Who's in favor, Tom, of keeping them?
Well, as I said, because the American public, by and large, has moved on to other issues, those that benefit directly from nuclear weapons are the ones that have the most sway and the most say. So that is the military, parts of the military that benefit from having nuclear weapons, defense contractors who make billions of dollars every year from producing nuclear weapons, members of Congress who have those weapons in their districts and whose jobs in their districts they're protecting. So there are vested interests that want to keep nuclear weapons. And unless the American people demand it very strongly of their leaders, the vested interests will hold sway.
Now, nuclear energy is a part of life, William, right? Doesn't nuclear energy light up a lot of homes in America?
Nuclear energy does light up a lot of homes in America, and it can do it safely as well. The one problem with nuclear energy is that the nuclear reactors that generate the fuel for the reactors, the fuel for nuclear energy, can also generate fuel that can be used to make a nuclear bomb. So there's a possibility that a country that has nuclear energy might use their nuclear reactors to divert them into a nuclear weapon program. That happened, for example, with North Korea. And it could happen with Iran as well, which is why we're so concerned about Iran's nuclear reactor program.
This may seem simplified. Tom, where are our nuclear bombs? Where are they?
Well, hundreds of them are deployed in the upper Midwest in land-based silos, but the largest proportion of our arsenal is based at sea, at submarines, within submarines that are under the oceans or in ports ready to deploy, which is why we say we don't need the land-based ballistic missiles. We could safely retire those because we have so many nuclear weapons deployed at sea. Even if we didn't have the land-based missiles, we would have deterrence against Russia, because even if Russia attacked us, we would still have the sea-based missiles to respond.
Secretary Perry, on a scale of 1 to 10, how worried are you about this?
I think the possibility of a nuclear catastrophe today is greater than it was during the Cold War.
Wow.
I wouldn't say it's 10%. It's less than that. Maybe it's only 1 in 100. But those are good odds if you're playing poker, but it's not very good odds if the end of the world is at stake. So whatever they are, I really can't put a number on, but whatever they are, we should work to reduce them.
This is a very important book. Thank you both very much, former Secretary of Defense William Perry and Tom Collina, Director of Policy at Plowshares Fund. Thanks for being with us on Politicking.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us, Larry.